Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I used to be Simon Marnie.
And I used to be Stan Grant.
And we are happy to be here today, but I'd like to start by saying Warami Ingani Naya Simon Marnie, Bayajul Budjuri Gadigul Gandangara, Bayajul Budjuri Gadigul Gandangara Nurugu, and Bayajul Budjuri Gadigul Gandangara Warangadgul Baranyin Yagu Barabigul Yanu, and so acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. A very special evening this evening, and we are very grateful for the invitation and presentation from the President of the New South Wales Legislative Council, the Honourable Ben Franklin. Prior to his role as President, Ben served as the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Minister for the Arts, Minister for Regional Youth and Minister for Tourism. So please welcome to the stage the Honourable Ben Franklin, President of the New South Wales Legislative Council.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land and extend my respect to elders past and present, and particularly to the many elders and First Nations people who I know are here with us this evening. You are all very welcome. It's my absolute privilege as President of the Legislative Council and one of the two presiding officers in the New South Wales Parliament to warmly welcome you all to Parliament's Theatrette for what promises to be a deeply thought-provoking and inspiring conversation between two of Australia's most insightful voices, Stan Grant and Simon Marnie. As the Parliament of New South Wales, we are committed to ensuring that this institution is a place where everyone is welcome and different voices can be heard. Through our programs, exhibitions and public events, we continue to create opportunities for First Nations voices within these walls, voices that challenge, teach and remind us of the deep knowledge and connection to country that have guided this land for tens of thousands of years. We recognise that this makes our democracy stronger, and we're proud that Aboriginal stories and perspectives are increasingly being woven into the life of this place. One of the most visible examples of this is the Reconciliation Wall in Parliament's Fountain Court, a dedicated space that we established more than a quarter of a century ago to celebrate and showcase First Nations art and culture. Across from the Rec Wall permanently hangs our bicentenary of the Legislative Council Art Commission, Wiradjuri by Gumbunya and Bundjalung artist Kim Healy. This striking piece is a bold and unmissable expression of cultural strength and belonging, and it sits right at the heart of the New South Wales Parliament. Last year, we unveiled an acknowledgement of country sculpture and plaque in the Parliament's forecourt, a lasting reminder that this building, indeed this entire state, sits on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as part of the bicentenary of the Legislative Council, this June we hosted the Parliament's inaugural Young Aboriginal Leaders program, bringing together 20 emerging leaders from communities from across the state to learn about our democratic system, to share their voices and to imagine their own role in shaping the future of this institution and of our state. These initiatives are not symbolic. They are living acts of recognition and respect. And tonight's event, Stan Grant in Conversation with Simon Marnie, continues in that spirit. Together, Stan and Simon will explore the legacy of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, published in 1859 and one of the most influential books of scientific literature ever written. Together, they'll examine the way its ideas continue to shape our thinking about faith, culture, morality, law, education, and identity. And I'm particularly excited to hear this discussion led by Stan, a Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi man, an award-winning journalist, a filmmaker and author who has spent his life interrogating questions of who we are, where we come from, and how we understand each other. And of course, expertly guiding this conversation is Simon Marnie, whose decades of storytelling and broadcasting have connected countless Australians through the sharing of culture and community. This evening invites us to reflect on different ways of knowing, the patterns and teachings held on country and shared within our communities, the scientific insights that have transformed our understanding of life, and the enduring power of conversation to connect them. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to our Parliament's Aboriginal liaison officers, Joe Stewart and Damon Goolagong, for their ongoing leadership and for bringing this remarkable event to life tonight. And thank you all once again for joining us here in your Parliament, the People's Parliament, for an evening of reflection, learning and connection. Please enjoy what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much to the Honourable Ben Franklin. This event is being recorded, as will be the Q&A. And if you are sitting and can move a little bit to the centre, there will be latecomers coming in, and that will save them having to walk all the way across the room in front of you. So just move in if you can. A little other note is that if you didn't see them on the way in, there are the first editions from Charles Darwin in a case, and you'll notice that Origin of Species is in a different binding. It's a preservation binding, but it's still the first edition, and it's a privilege that the State Parliament can have a book whose full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. It's a loaded sentence. It's an incredible book, and I know for you, Stan Grant, it holds a strong fascination, not just a little fascination, but a strong fascination. So let's look at and start by looking when the Origin came out. What was happening to humanity at that time?
Yeah, again, thank you for everyone for turning out tonight, and thank you for the Parliament for putting this on, and Joe and DJ, my cousin, for helping me come here and be part of this, and to you, Simon, as well. What fascinates me as an Aboriginal person, and I think I've made this my life mission, I think, from when I was very young, is to understand what landed here in 1770 with Cook, but probably even more pertinently in 1788 when strangers came to stay. What landed here? H.G. Wells, you may not know, based War of the Worlds on reading about what was then considered the extermination or extinction of Aboriginal people in Tasmania. He'd read about that in a newspaper, and he was out walking with his brother, and he said it must have been like the Martians landed. What was it like to see those sails on the horizon? For everything that you believed to be true, to no more be true, because someone comes with a truth that confounds yours. What is it like for thousands of years of technology and science and philosophy and theology to land here in what is a blink of an eye in time, 240 plus years? And one of the things that I've dedicated my life to doing is just exhaustively reading everything that I could possibly know about what put those people here. I wanted to know the theology. I studied for a PhD in theology. I wanted to know about the philosophy that centered man, humans, at the heart of the story of the universe. I wanted to know about Enlightenment philosophy that gave us a new idea of what a human being was, gave us two of the great revolutions of modernity, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And Australia sits in the middle, not in the middle, but between those revolutions, 1776, 1789 and 1788. This lands here. I've always been fascinated by that. And Darwin, of course, is one of the seminal works of imagining this new world, a world of the supremacy of science, a world of determinism, a world of time, an entirely new conception of time. And then how do we live with that? And what happens to a people when that new idea of time lands here?
So explain for me the Aboriginal concept of time.
I was recently reading a book by William Stanner. He was the great Australian anthropologist. And he was talking about his time amongst the Murrumbata people of the Northern Territory. And there was one line in the book, he was talking about cosmology, Aboriginal cosmology. And there was one line in the book that I think was too much for even him to contemplate. And when I read that, so many things fell into place for me in trying to contemplate this clash of humanity and a different idea of what a human being was. And he said amongst the Murrumbata, which he also found replicated amongst his time with other Aboriginal peoples, he said they are a people of no memory and a people of no time. And he moves on. And what he said was that even he was talking to the people about a massacre that had taken place 40 years previously. And some of the members of the people that he lived among, family members, had been killed. And he said it was as though it never happened. And there you have the fundamental difference. A people who were not timeless, because to be timeless is to be in relationship to time. It is a negative relationship to time, but time still determines that relationship. He came up with a phrase called the every when, a now happening at all times, then and now and into the future. And that doesn't get there either. We are talking about no relationship to time whatsoever. There is no subjective ordering of the world. There is an objective totality, a relationship to all, in all, at all possible moments, extending forever and no separation between what was and what will be. Imagine a world where I cannot say I cannot say you, I cannot say above or below, yesterday or tomorrow. This is an entirely mind-blowing idea of what it is to exist in a permanence that is not eternity, because it does not stretch to a point that begins or ends. It is so mind-blowing, Simon, and it haunted me when I read this, because what happens when the boats arrive, and what happened with Darwin in particular, is the idea that we emerge in time. We think evolution is the great epiphany, the great discovery of Charles Darwin. Hands up who's read On the Origin of Species? No, quite a few. How many times did the word evolution appear in the book? Never. The word evolved does towards the end. Natural selection is what sets it apart. Other people had been ploughing the same field. There'd been other ideas about what we saw as change amongst species. But Darwin gave us the idea of a natural selective process. I'll come to what the consequences of that were a little bit later. But the great revelation, the truly revolutionary idea, is time. The idea that banishes God, and remember, we didn't invent atheism, you did. Let that be on you. And Richard Dawkins is quite happy to wear that. But for Aboriginal people, the idea of imagining a world where there was not a relationship to the divine is unthinkable, utterly unthinkable. And what Darwin struggles with, and he did struggle with this because he was raised in the church. He was going to be ordained himself. His wife was devout in her religious faith. I think it was the idea that time kills God. If God is unchanging, if God is forever and permanent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, what happens if time is the determinant of creation? What happens if we don't arrive and we are not fully formed, but we emerge in time? St. Augustine famously said, what was God doing before he created time? He was creating hell for the overcurious. And Darwin was in this hell of his own epiphany. This journey on the Beagle that brought him to Australia and to other places, the Galapagos in particular, but this idea that we emerge in time. Time is the revolutionary idea, and it is the idea that gets modernity started. The modern world is a new relationship to time. What happens in the French Revolution? The clock is reset. So the idea of time is what arrives here and is revolutionary. So to go back to your question of cosmological difference, imagine living in a world where you cannot locate yourself in time. There is no requirement for memory because events do not exist in a linear relationship to time. And there is a repetition and a ceremony that celebrates a permanent, objective relationship to the divine that always is and always will be and is always in the moment, to the idea that arrives here that time determines existence.
You mentioned there the natural selection in which Darwin said the fittest are not necessarily the strongest or the fastest, but the most adaptable to change.
It was really the idea of this emergence of change, particularly he noticed in variation in domestication, and where you start to see in isolation things starting to appear that go to this development of characteristics and traits that are going to enable the survival of that species. And it is the adaptability to those environments that are key to that.
And so then, if the book challenges creation and God's creation of the world and goes into the idea of us evolving, how significant is it atheistic evolution that makes Darwin acceptable, that it was actually God that created the circumstances for evolution?
Well, there was a lot of thought around at the time, and the idea of the watchmaker God, the God that gets it started and it begins to tick. There were people who saw this as heretical, and this caused enormous ructions when it came to the idea of faith. Reverend Charles Kingsley, I think, really captured this. He was at Cambridge University, and he really captured this best for me when he said, it isn't that Darwin gets rid of the idea of religion, but he asks us to think again about it. And I think for me, as someone who studied theology, who's an Aboriginal person, who's a practicing Catholic, how do I come to terms with this revolutionary idea that can seem, and certainly someone like Richard Dawkins would say, negates the idea of a religious faith? James Watson, who discovered DNA, said, in future generations, Darwin will be seen as more important than Jesus Christ. So what do I take from this? And of course, one of the things that we see at the time in the discussion is the way that different nations grappled with this revolutionary idea. In England, there was vociferous debate around what this means for faith and religion. I'll come to the United States and later in the 1920s with the Scopes trial that people would be familiar with. But in Australia as well, there was a lot of discussion. We overlook the level of sophistication in Australia. This was an extremely learned population. The level of debate, the journals that were published, the discussion, the philosophical, theological, scientific discussion that was being undertaken here was incredibly sophisticated. And we did not come to this in Australia, by and large, with the sense of existential panic that gripped others in the world. The ability to be able to incorporate science and faith, to be able to see these things as being different domains, but also at their heart areas that we can learn from one another, was incorporated here in a way that other parts of the world didn't. There was no Scopes equivalent of a Scopes trial here, and the Scopes trial was in the United States in the 1920s, I think, when there was legislation being passed in various states of America to ban the teaching of evolution, and this was challenged, and ultimately the teacher who was said to be teaching this heretical science, who was actually a football coach and not even a science teacher, but was dragged into the trial anyway, was actually given a $100 fine. But this idea of putting evolution on trial, and at the time it was said either evolution falls or Christianity falls. And for the defence they said either evolution is proved or civilization falls. We didn't have that in Australia. And in the United Kingdom, there was also a different discussion around what this presented. I think that we're still working through this question of what is faith, what is God, and what is science. I think the other great scientific revolution that really reframes the question of faith and religion is certainly Newton's idea of gravity and Newton's idea of time. But beyond that, special and general relativity from Einstein and quantum physics. And I love this quote from Werner Heisenberg, who is one of the founders of quantum physics and won the Nobel Prize for Physics at the age of 22 or 23, which makes our achievements look pretty paltry, Simon. And Werner Heisenberg discovered the uncertainty principle. I bore you with the intricacies of that, but essentially uncertainty sits at the heart of quantum physics, what the world looks like in its most micro state. Essentially, you can't determine both velocity and position. One changes the relationship to the other. And he said, the first sip of the cup of science will make you an atheist. And then he added, God waits at the bottom of the glass. and it was so brilliant, and I think that really encapsulates it for me. Every layer that we peel back of science reveals more of the mystery. There was a wonderful conversation between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, who was one of the founders of quantum physics. And Einstein opens the door to quantum, but it was a door that he could not walk in. He thought the whole idea of quantum was too spooky. He called it spooky science at a distance. And in this discussion, Einstein says to Niels Bohr, God doesn't play dice. And Niels Bohr said to Einstein, who are you to say what God can do? So I think this is science for me, and I think Darwin sits right at the heart of this, and this troubled him. It troubled him in his relationship with his wife, who was devoutly religious. It had a really personal impact as well, because his daughter died. And of course this is devastating for anyone, and there's this image that I have, and it was so heartbreaking when I read this. Someone who had lost his faith, and when his family would go to church, of course they would pray and they would mourn his daughter's death, that Darwin would go walking alone. It just breaks my heart when I hear that, to someone walking alone with his memories and his grief in a science where he cannot see the face of God, and separated from his family. You can see the stakes and how heavily they weighed upon him.
One of the things I want to draw it back to, though, is also the role of Indigenous Australians in Darwin's visit here in the 5-year journey he did on the Beagle. And it's a long... I'm going to try and truncate it, but he writes in his diary, not in Origin, that at sunset by good fortune, a party of a score of the Aboriginal blacks passed by, each carrying in their accustomed manner a bundle of spears and other weapons. They were all partly clothed. Several could speak a little English. Their countenances were good-humoured and pleasant, and they appeared far from such utterly degraded beings as usually represented. In their own arts, they're admirable. A cap being fixed at 30 yards distance, they transfixed it with a spear delivered by a throwing stick. They would not, however, cultivate the ground or even take the trouble of keeping flocks of sheep which had been offered to them. Darwin seems to observe there, and I wonder how that feels to you as an Indigenous Australian, hearing his observation of Aborigines.
Well, there was worse than that, Simon. We've sadly grown used to hearing worse than that. And one of the things that Darwin also said was that perhaps it would be right that we would go the way of other species, that inevitably we would fade from the earth.
Yeah.
And this idea of what Daisy Bates, I think it was called smoothing the dying pillow, that our people would simply disappear. You know, and the whole notion of colonisation was predicated on the Lockean idea of sovereignty coming with the tilling of the soil, you know, the John Locke idea of what sovereignty is. And of course, we've seen a whole lot of work from Bill Grammage, we've seen work from Bruce Pascoe and others that show the level of sophistication in engagement in things like agriculture and horticulture and harvesting and in a relationship to land, burning off land, that showed a great deal of sophistication in our practices and the way that we'd adapted to life here. But in the cold, hard light of day, to people who are coming here with an entirely different frame of reference, we see things like this said. He also saw the impact of what Europeans were bringing here.
And this is where he writes, the decrease in numbers of Indigenous Australians must be owing to the drinking of spirits, the European diseases, even the milder ones, of which, such as measles, are very destructive. He actually saw what the white settlement was doing to Indigenous Australians.
It has a very personal resonance for me, because the time in which he was coming here was a time when some of the remnants of First Peoples of this area were huddled together in the boat sheds at Circular Quay. And I found a reference to my great-great-grandfather, who Wiradjuri and Dharawal on my father's side and Kamilaroi on my mother's side. And my great-great-grandfather was a Dharawal man. He came from around La Perouse and down his family down on the south coast. And of the people, after the initial impact of disease, being uprooted, the violence of the Sydney Wars, he was a young boy huddled in the boat sheds of Circular Quay, he and his family. His father was found dead on the streets, visiting family members up at Double Bay, what is now Double Bay. And there was a little article in the newspaper of the time, and they were preparing for a royal visit. And this is around the time that Darwin had been here. And they said, how can we have these people dying in our streets when we're going to be hosting royalty? And from this, they eventually set up the Aborigines Protection Board. They started to move people out of these areas and out west. And my great-great-grandfather, Frank Foster, who was a young man at the time, he was about 6 or 7 years old, was moved out west and married into Wiradjuri people. So when what Darwin observes is happening to my family. And what's extraordinary about this is that, you know, we think of these things as being historical events, these things that happened in the past. No. When I was a boy, my great-grandmother was alive. I could touched the hand of my great-grandmother, who touched the hand of her father, who was living in the boat shed at Circular Quay, whose grandparents stood on the shore and saw the ships come. And these are the people that Darwin is talking about.
Unfortunately, we never changed, because living in Brisbane in 1984, I saw Joh Bjelke-Petersen shut down South Brisbane, which was the Redfern equivalent of Brisbane, because he didn't want people coming to Expo to see Aboriginal Australians.
Yeah, yeah.
We didn't learn.
No, we don't. There were so many things we don't learn from. But this is what fascinated me about this whole period, and it's what led me to reading on the Origin of Species, and a long time ago now since I've read that, but also Descent of Man. I want to come to that. There's something in the title there that I think we should also explore. But I'm trying to understand, what is this thing called modernity? What has brought these people here? And what we are seeing is the collapse of time and space. Technology, a new time invented, a time of humans becoming. This goes back to the Greeks. You know, the ancient Greeks, there was a debate between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides believed in a static time, in a being, that humans occupied a permanence of being. Heraclitus, of course, believed that people moved through time. You know the famous saying that you cannot cross the same river twice? The river changes and you change. And this is at the heart of what Darwin's wrestling with. He's wrestling with an idea of time and the changing nature of time. And this arrives here to a people, as I said before, who are living in a place beyond a conception of time at all. In the same year that Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, publishes On Liberty. So what's happening in the world at this time? If we go back 500 years, René Descartes, mathematician, so it's always this clash of science and God. So René Descartes, who's a mathematician, he ponders the idea of God's existence, and he wonders if God may be a trick of the mind, if maybe there is a demon in the universe that plants the idea of a creator in his mind. And then he says, but if I can think, God has given me the capacity to think. If I can even think that a demon exists that tricks the mind into believing God exists, then God must have given me the capacity to think, therefore, God exists because I can think God exists. You know the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That is revolutionary. Never before had humanity said this. All ancient peoples had lived in an idea where you do not think yourself into existence. You are part of an existence of the divine. And from there, you get the Copernican revolution. Suddenly, we are not the centre of the universe. We orbit the sun. This changes our relationship to questions of time and creation and our place in the ordered universe. I've put it this way. 500 years ago, humans start a quarrel with God over time. And we say to God, you can have eternity. We'll be the masters of time. And everything begins from this moment of controlling time in our time. And if we've had the Copernican revolution, if Newton has given us a relationship to time and gravity, which still orders so much of our world, what do we do with a human being? How do human beings live together if we are now developing technology that shrinks space? People can come from places that were unimaginable before. The technology that was required to bring the strangers here had never existed. Time disappeared and space shrunk. What do we do then with each other? So you have people like John Stuart Mill imagining ideas of liberty. Suddenly we're freed from a God-ordered world, a divinely ordered world. We are free to emerge into time itself. Time is the engine of our creation. So if the human is upended in this new idea of time, how do we live together without tearing each other to pieces? If we're going to confront people of such difference, what regulates that difference? John Stuart Mill starts to develop ideas of liberty, liberalism, which leads to ideas of freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of speech, leads to ideas of human rights. There's a whole lot of other philosophers we could go into that set against the backdrop of this, struggling with an idea of where is God in the world, who are we? Are we the masters of our domain? And how do we deal with this emergence of a new time? So all of those things were happening at the same time as the ships arrived here, and this book, and that's why this book is so fundamental.
But this is a time where ships were arriving. It's a book that took over 35 years to write and get published in
The
1859.
big book, he called it, because
he
he had written the long essay with Wallace. It was Wallace who really got him started, because Wallace was also working on ideas of evolutionary change, and Darwin realised he didn't want to miss the boat, and they co-authored this together.
So was it a catalyst for change, scientifically, philosophically, religiously, that had a finite end, or does the ramifications of On Origin of Species deliver us an insight into the future?
Well, we're still struggling with this question, aren't we, of where is the human and where is the divine? What defines humanity? Are we mechanical? One of the metaphysical questions that emerged, and there are many ways of looking at On the Origin of Species. I'm not a biologist, I'm not an ecologist, so I read it with a theological and a philosophical lens, and it lends itself to all of these interpretations. But one of the things that it raises is, if we are essentially mechanical, if we are these wet machines, is one of the terms that is used, and we are going through a mechanical process of change over time, what does it say about morality? What do we owe one another? We are not, if we are crossing Heraclitus's river, metaphorically, constantly, what do I owe you? If I commit a crime against you, I'm not even the same person who has committed that crime 5 minutes later. If society is going through this constant process of change, if there is this movement through time and God is unchanging, where does morality derive from? If morality does not come from some sense of obedience to a divine law, what laws can we enact that hold this together? Immanuel Kant, critiqued this critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason. He stretched the limits of reason. He said, ultimately, you can't reconcile these two things: the noumenal world, the world of the soul, the world of the spirit, the world of the things beyond what we know, and the phenomenological world that Darwin is living in. Darwin is living in a phenomenological world, a world of what we can prove, a world of what we can scientifically measure, a mathematical world. Trying to rationalise those things has been at the fundamental core of how we hold this hitherto unimaginable experiment of modernity together, Simon. It is an extraordinary experiment. Human beings were never designed, perhaps, to even live with this level of proximity. Suddenly, look at our world today. We share space with people of such vast difference, culturally, religiously, physically, in ways that our parents or our grandparents would never have. And all of this begins from this moment of reimagining time and space, our movement in time and space, and our technology that allows us to shrink time and space. Zygmunt Bauman, a sociologist writing in the sort of 1990s, when it came to the year 2000 and people were concerned about the Y2K bug, and he wrote a book called Liquid Modernity. And liquid modernity, he says, is a time when we don't have anywhere to stand. The world is fluid. There is no certainty. Quantum physics delivers us to a place of uncertainty. The laws of the universe no longer hold. He said, in this liquid modernity, we have moved beyond the time of Darwin and others when the possession of territory, some spatial control, some Newtonian idea of gravity that sets and borders idea of nation states. Nation states are a response to two things. The wars of religion, which emerged just at this time, when the world is coming to grips with this new way of seeing the world and where is God, Reformation, wars of religion, and then the Newtonian idea of gravity that sets the idea of the modern nation state. What is a modern nation state? It's based on Newtonian principles of equal and opposite force. You know the Newtonian pendulum, the balls that strike and return back to a point of stasis? That is the idea of the modern nation state. We are bordered, we have these relationships to each other to return to some permanence. That doesn't exist in the 21st century. The biggest state in the world now is Facebook, that exists in cyberspace. Every year, more members of Facebook, more citizens of Facebook than India and China combined. We keep imagining a world, and I want to come to Aboriginal people in a moment. We imagine a world of 18th and 19th century Darwinian science, Newtonian gravity, Kantian ethics, and ideas of civilizing liberty. But we live in a 21st century of quantum uncertainty, a collapse of space and time to the point of instantaneity. We can have anything we want immediately. I have Darwin's complete works on this phone, which has more computer power than NASA required to put people on the moon. 2007, this iPhone is created. Last week in Melbourne, in under 20 years, we've gone from that to the first commercially available human-computer hybrid. That is a computer with human brain cells. This is how quickly it's moving. This is what kept Darwin up at night. This is why it took so long to write the book. The existential questions he was grappling with. If we live in a world of scientific determinism, if you remove the divine, where is the soul? What orders the soul? What relationship do we have to one another? In the future, nation states, in fact, even if they have today, will have no purchase. Our children, our grandchildren are not going to live in bordered nation states. They don't already. They trade, they have friendships, they download music, they do whatever they want in cyberspace. So when we talk about sovereignty, we're not talking about bordered states. So to come to the implications for Aboriginal people, in a 21st century of liquid modernity, in a 21st century where wealth and power is no longer possession, but your mobility, your ability to move. The richest person in the world, Elon Musk, has sold all his houses. He lives in a collapsible $20,000 demountable house in Texas because he plans on spending more time in the air than on the ground. That is what determines wealth and power today. Mobility, being untethered from Earth, being untethered from the human. If we're living in that world, when we come to devise Aboriginal treaties, when we talk about Aboriginal sovereignty, we can't talk about 18th and 19th century ideas of territory. We can't talk about land. We have to talk about cyberspace. We have to talk about what does Aboriginal existence, if thousands of years of science and philosophy and theology landed in one day, We have to imagine now what it is for us to live in a world of quantum uncertainty, a collapse of time and space, the end of bordered sovereignty. What does that mean for Aboriginal people who are still working our way through this clash of cosmology? What are we doing signing treaties that are about possession of land when land is no longer a determinant of sovereignty at all? Where is an Aboriginal cosmology, an Aboriginal way of being? How do we locate Aboriginal ideas of justice and dispossession? If we don't have treaties that don't have some recognition or some inclusion of data, information, cyberspace, we'll be dispossessed all over again. So the implications of all of this, Simon, are absolutely enormous.
I want to throw it over to...
Oh, can I just, before we go... Look, once you get me started, honestly, this keeps me up at night. Tracy, my wife's sitting in the front here and she says, Stan, you've got to sleep and you've got to stop this. But I found something. Now, this will blow your mind. Here's in the... I could download it because I can't bring in my copy, which is huge. I've got a big old leather-bound copy on the origin of species. But I did download it onto Kindle today, and I want you to listen to this. Now, this is as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary, however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of survival and thus be naturally selected from the strong principle of inheritance. Any selected variety will tend to propagate, this is the key bit, will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Think about artificial intelligence. Ray Kurzweil, who is one of the masterminds of Google, computer scientist, the inventor of tomorrow, a genius by any measure. He talks about something called, this is an extension of Darwinian evolution. This is what would have kept Darwin up at night. He talks about the singularity. Does anyone know what the singularity is? The singularity is when the human, the biological, and the computer, the technical, are indistinguishable. Now, last week, the first commercially available human-computer hybrid, 20 years after the iPhone. The human is indistinguishable from the machine. Ray Kurzweil says this, in the 21st century alone, in this 100 years, we will undergo the equivalent of 20,000 years of technological progress. Now, for our grandchildren, this will mean they will never die. And he says this, immortality is with us. We will have the first generation that never dies because the body is no longer the determinant. We are uploaded consciousness into a machine. That is natural selection. Any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. This is Darwin. This is Darwin writing then. And Ray Kurzweil. And he says, 20,000 years of technological progress in 100 years. There'll be no need for a human child to actually be born of a human being. There'll be no need. And Kurzweil was asked this by Bill Gates. Bill Gates said to him, is there a God in the singularity? To take us full circle, Darwin is part of the science that kills God. And Kurzweil is asked, is there a God in the singularity? And he says, no, but there will be.
Wow.
Too many things in my mind, Simon.
No. Well, that comes down to the whole notion of population selection, where I think natural selection acts on the individuals, but
isn't it amazing what Darwin...
over time,
but now we're fast
at the population level, and that time is now shrinking.
Now, that's why I say the big innovation, the revolutionary idea, was not evolution, it was time. That's the revolutionary force.
And time is the key to population selection.
And it's the key tonight, because we'll run out of it soon. But
well, we won't, because I'm going to jump in and say, if you have questions, please put your hands in the air. We have 2 roving mics that you can do. And while we're doing that, I would like to point out there's a question down here at the front, that the beautiful paintings...
I was going to say, one of me is more than enough, and I walk in here tonight and there's 3 of me, but is Bruno here? Bruno there. Please stand, Bruno. Bruno painted these of me several years ago, and I've never seen them. I've never seen these ones. Thank you, Bruno.
Question down here.
Hi, Uncle. My name is Nicole.
Hey.
I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman.
Oh, where are you from?
Around Dubbo, so we're still
I've got family
working
around
through
there.
our kid. I also teach at Chifley College, Mount Druitt. So I teach a lot of Aboriginal kids and lead Aboriginal education there. And my concern is that students are now losing their thirst for knowledge. So I'm listening to you, and you can quote this, quote that. My kids are incredibly and increasingly using AI technology.
Yes.
We're losing that connection to culture.
Yes.
We're losing connection to country. We're losing authentic learning. What do I do? What would you say? How do I get my kids to have their own creative ideas that are connected to culture, are connected to their history, connected to their people?
It's a big question. First of all, we have to go back and redefine these terms. We've always had technology. Our people had technology. We had ways of creating relationships to where we were that enhanced our lives. Technology in and of itself is not a bad thing. I wouldn't be here without it. The ships didn't just bring time, they brought an Irish convict, and he's in my DNA, and that's why I've got the name Grant, and, I'm happy to be Irish too, And funnily enough, when I first went to Ireland, I just felt like I was when I was back on country. I just went, this is my home. I could feel it. I could feel it in my bones. So that's important. I like the idea that our kids are our Aboriginality is fulfilled and enhanced in our relationship to others and the world. I say I'm a Catholic, and every time I go to Mass, I'm participating in something that is magical to me. In the Eucharist, I have to suspend all of Darwinian science, all the quantum physics, and believe, and I believe, and it's not hard for me as an Aboriginal person to believe this, that I am partaking of the blood and flesh of Christ. I am doing that, not symbolically. And I do this in communion with other people in a way that is transcendent and magical, and that's the most Wiradjuri I ever feel, is when I'm in that magical place. And so I think for our kids, give them a sense of wonder. The machine doesn't have our magic. The machine has illusion. Let them look at a sunrise and a sunset and don't take a photo of it on their phone. I was a weird kid, right? I was living in... I went to 14 different schools before I was even into high school. We were a poor family, itinerant family. We moved around. We had no money. Dad was working in sawmills whenever he could get work. Mum had to knock on the doors of churches just to get food vouchers for us. But she brought home these books from second-hand stores, and I devoured everything that I could read. And I remember one Christmas she gave me a gift of Greek mythology. And what 10-year-old Aboriginal kid... But this is beautiful, because that's my world too. Someone once said to me, who's your favourite Aboriginal writer? And I said, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Why? Because Because as a Russian writer, he speaks to my Aboriginal soul. Being Aboriginal is not to be held apart from the world. It is not to be scared of the world. It's not to be scared of science and technology. It's to embrace it all, but to never lose sight of the thing that we know, that we are part of the divine. Never allow them to lose the mystery and the magic and the mysticism. We didn't invent atheism. That came on the boats too.
Over down here at the front.
Hi, Stan.
Hello.
And Simon. We've met a little while ago. My name's
Outside, yes, I said hello to you.
And you interviewed me. I'm the sister of Wayne Fella Morrison, who was killed in custody.
That's right.
In 2016. I'm a week out from submitting my PhD with Larissa at Jumbunna.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. I'm very tired. But I came, and I'm glad I really came today because you've affirmed a lot for me. But I have a very serious question that might be beyond this room. In articulating my work around my brother's death and coronial inquests, specifically in the jurisdiction here in New South Wales, where obviously Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan has just announced that we have seen the highest rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody to date in this jurisdiction since 91. And so it's fast increasing. So I'm trying to theorise, well, when we go to the coroner's inquests and, consider resistance to Aboriginal deaths in custody, I theorise that the coronial court in many ways renders us subjective and obsolete, and also to contain and govern black death and black life through these state mechanisms, through the governance of black life, and what that means not only for somebody like my brother and other inquests, but also for our families and also Aboriginal people, and how we move into a future where this is still systemically continuing to render us invisible. So I've actually theorised this as black space. And I do this through podcasting at the moment, and I've worked with different Aboriginal women and families around their experiences to articulate the violence of the coronial inquest system in our lives ongoing. And I theorise this as when we protest this state and as an act of decolonisation, we're opening up moments of black space for our loved ones to survive and thrive, and for us, but also as sovereignty. When you talk about borders and the borderlessness, yeah, it's really resonating. But my question, listening to you, is a bit heartbreaking, and it's a philosophical question. Has colonisation been completed, and has it actually moved on? Not from us, we're still here, and that's amazing. Always was, always will be. But has the actual colonial project succeeded in a sense that in the future now, because of the individualisation that we're all facing, away and being separated from our communities because of the machine, giving us our individual rights, are we any more... the colonial project is obviously about taking over land and state and country and rendering Aboriginal people invisible from that and off of that land and country, which they can never do. But moving forward, when we're thinking about decolonial practice, how are we going to fight the colonial side of that when it no longer is about land, but it's about space?
Well, and this is one of the... And thank you, and my sympathies to your family. We've had these conversations before, and that obviously sits at the heart of your work. There is and as I was saying before, when Darwin's talking about these people, they're not abstract. They're our family. They're people we touch. That's why I said to you before that if we are not cognizant of the shifting dynamics of knowledge, power, wealth and sovereignty, then you are dispossessed again. And we are still, as a people, and not just us, but the whole world, the world's trying to solve 21st century questions with 20th century answers. How often do you hear people talk about, we must restore the liberal rules-based order? I reported from 80 countries. I was overseas reporting for 40 years. I've been to almost every war of the last 40 years, and I've never seen it. I've seen a power-based order. I've never seen a global rules-based order. We make those rules up as we go. 20th century answers will not solve 21st century questions. We don't even have people thinking about that. And for our people, we're still in many ways, reminded of, still trapped in an 18th, 19th, 20th century history. And our reference points for justice are those reference points. So when we talk about things like treaty, they're still framed around Lockean ideas of sovereignty. We talk about land rights and native title as emancipatory in their own way as they may be. They are still framed within the very systems that you're talking about, right? And you know, native title is often seen as being something that repudiated terra nullius. In fact, native title only fell to the soil with the planting of the British flag. It was British law that was used to recognise extant Aboriginal law. So there is a system that we are trapped within. And my point too is, if we don't have our people, I want more of our people to study physics. I want more of our people to start thinking in ways beyond the systems that we think in now, because the 21st century won't look... We're ageing 100 years a day under Ray Kurzweil's idea of progress, which will change everything. We're ageing 100 years a day, and our thinking needs to be adaptive to what these new systems will be. Decolonisation is also an old idea for me, because we're decolonising something that's already gone. The colonisers as well have lost their space. The 21st century is determined by no space, non-space, the ability to free yourself from space. The people who may survive the climate catastrophe and whatever else we do on Earth will be the richest people who can escape the Earth. And this is Musk's dream. That's where power and wealth and future lies, in the same way that the people who came here came under a power and esteem and a wealth that our people did not have, and we still sit under it. So for me, so much of this work has been about, from a young age, going back and exploring on the origin of species. I read that to you before. You lay that over what we're doing now. He saw it. He saw this change. The theologians, you know, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, these are massive minds who were asking the deepest questions. Newton, Einstein, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Simone Weil, the people who were asking these extraordinary questions, the poets and the artists, the people, our people. David Maljale, just to come full circle with this conversation. Well, we're talking about decolonisation. Colonisation's already gone. It's been swept away on the tide of progress. Transhumanism puts an end to that. Transhuman potentially puts an end to the entire human experience as we've known it. David Maljale, a Narrabeen man from Western Australia, now gone. I had the honour of meeting him when I was a young boy, and it left an indelible mark on me. Extraordinary man. He had the greatest title in all the world. He was known amongst his people as the keeper of creation. The keeper of creation. And Maljale, he wrote a poem, and I went to this after the Voice referendum failed, and it haunted me. And it in fact, my last book, Muriang, Song of Time, which was about time and faith and culture, came from this. And he said this, he said, "Once I was past and future, now I am only present today. And it is hard to bear with no past and no future." And it haunted me because he wasn't saying, once I had a past and a future, once I was all in all times, all places, all being. And now I am just in this eternal day, this endless moment. And that's really where we're all at. All of humanity is in this eternal moment. James Watson, who mapped DNA, and said before, thinks that Darwin will in future be known as greater than Christ. What did the mapping of the human genome show us? It showed us that 99.9% of our genetic structure is exactly the same. What we do to each other in that fraction of a percent is brutal. And I imagine now you and I are sitting here with the histories that we have and trying to grapple with this. I can't even begin to think of what it's going to be like in 30 or 40 years for our children or grandchildren. But we need to be thinking in 22nd century thought and not 18th, 19th and 20th century thought. Darwin gives way to the singularity.
The thing I find fascinating about Stan Grant is that in a conversation with him, you leave wanting to ask more questions than when you
Can I just squeeze one more in? Because
you can, but I'm going to have to tell people here that we don't have time for any more questions. Did you have one more thing you wanted to know?
Someone with their hand up.
There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people with their hand up. I think
anyway, it's always good to have more thoughts, and it's just a great invitation. When Simon asked me to do this, I was like, yeah, I'd love to do this, because it's not that On the Origin of Species is a transformative, it's a earth-shattering, piece of work by an extraordinary mind that did give us ideas of evolution and natural selection, that did change the way we see the world. It forced us to think again about the human, about the cosmos, about our place in it all. And it continues. And I suppose for all of us, if tonight you walk away wanting to ask that deeper question, think again about things like sovereignty, territory, space, time. Think what a 21st century is going to look like. Think about how natural selection ends when we no longer have to give birth to a child, and the human, computer, hybrid, whatever that is, becomes what we call life. And where is the soul? And if there's one thing about my people that I know, is that we have held on, not because we were powerful, we saw the world end, not because we were rich, but because we had a soul and we knew what love was. And I'll defy anyone to put love under a microscope and point at it and tell me that's what it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stan Grant. Thank you so much to Damon and Joe, who are the Aboriginal liaison officers here. This is one of the many things that I've done. I salute Adam Hills down there, Black Douglas. We had a great session with him, and they also have had dinners here with Indigenous chefs. So keep your eye on the parliamentary website to find out what else we can fascinate you with in this auditorium. But for the moment, thank you for coming along. Have a great evening. Good night.